Hello everyone, thanks for joining us here for This Week in Agribusiness. Last week I had the opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C. to catch up with regulators and legislators, and I had the chance to talk with Kaitlynn Glover, head of the Public Lands Council, about a new rule from the Bureau of Land Management. This new rule will really upend the way public lands are leased, and I asked Kaitlynn to give us the backstory.
Over the last year, the Bureau of Land Management, which manages hundreds of millions of acres across the West, has been going through this process that they've initially called the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule. They're now couching this as the Public Lands Rule because it is so expansive. And what we saw over the last 2 weeks is that the agency has now finalized that rule. This rule is unlike, I think, any other rule really that we've seen the agency pursue in the past. Normally, when you're talking about public lands uses, these vast open spaces, you know what the use of that land is going to be. It's going to be grazing or recreation or oil and gas development or hunting or fishing or whatever it might be. And because those uses have been established by Congress, it's predictable because Congress told the agency to manage the lands for these kinds of uses. The BLM has done that to varying degrees of success over the last several decades. But what we've seen over the last year is sort of a reimagining of their responsibilities. This public lands rule that we have seen the final text, it doesn't have the force of law quite yet, but we expect it to be finalized here soon. This final text essentially allows the BLM not only to manage for all of these other uses, but for conservation as a use itself. Now, conservation is an ethos, right? We manage for conservation outcomes. For grazing, that means that if you don't manage the land appropriately, then you're not going to be able to use it in the same way or to the same effect in the future. So conservation is an ethos. But what this final rule does is make it a use, attempt to monetize that use in a way that would really change the way that they manage all of those surface acres by establishing conservation leases, restoration leases, and mitigation leases.
So my understanding is they expect parties, groups to spend money to rent these parcels, lease these parcels, and then they're going to pursue conservation on it. Kaitlynn, conservation by whose standards, whose definition? How is this going to work?
I mean, you really hit the nail on the head, right? So the crux of the challenge here is that the two lease types, conservation leases and that could either be for restoration or for mitigation, really are sort of abstract, right? The agency has said, we'll accept applications for conservation activities, that you could put together a lease application, I could put together a lease application and say that I want to do X, Y, and Z on this particular parcel. It will go through some kind of yet to be determined evaluative process, and then the agency will give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Landscapes are intentionally managed and need to be intentionally managed because there is the potential for butterfly effect across a lot of different acres. You know, we've told the agency this for years through wildfire risk and invasive species. Allowing some of these part and parcel sort of random application of conservation, or you hope conservation practices, but of these applications over the hundreds of millions of acres has the potential not only to be really damaging, but to make the agency's mission impossible to execute. It is going to create conflict, not only because the process that they've set up hasn't really been fleshed all the way out, but also because every other use has specific congressional direction. This would be the only use that Congress didn't direct. And so figuring out how to balance those across the landscape would be nigh impossible. It creates risk for grazing permittees, it creates risk for all other users of public lands, and frankly for the agency themselves.
Thanks to Kaitlynn for filling us in, and to be sure, environmental groups have cheered this new public lands rule from the BLM, but it looks like it will be bogged down in court cases, probably by the time we get to summer.